It felt like time for another multi-day journey. So, this will probably be 2 days, maybe 3, probably 2. But it'll be a fun, weird little jaunt. The Story of the Late Mr. Elvesham by H.G. Wells. I set this story down not expecting it will be believed, but, if possible, to prepare a way of escape for my next victim. He perhaps may profit by my misfortune. My own case, I know, is hopeless, and I am now in some measure prepared to meet my fate. My name is Edward George Eden. I was born at Trentham in Staffordshire, my father being employed in the gardens there. I lost my mother when I was 3 years old and my father when I was 5. My uncle, George Eden, then adopting me as his own son. He was a single man, self-educated and well known in Birmingham as an enterprising journalist. He educated me generously, fired my ambition to succeed in the world, and at his death, which happened 4 years ago, left me his entire fortune, a matter of about £500 after all outgoing charges were paid. I was then 18. He advised me in his will to expend the money in completing my education. I had already chosen the profession of medicine, and through his posthumous generosity and my good fortune in a scholarship competition, I became a medical student at University College, London. At the time of the beginning of my story, I lodged at 11A University Street, in a little upper room, very shabbily furnished and draughty, overlooking the back of Schoolbridge's premises. I used this little room both to live in and to sleep in because I was anxious to eke out by means to the very last shilling's worth. I was taking a pair of shoes to be mended at the shop in Tottenham Court Road when I first encountered the little man with the yellow face, with whom my life has now become so inextricably entangled. He was standing on the curb and staring at the number on my door in a doubtful way as I opened it. His eyes, they were dull grey eyes and reddish under the rims, fell to my face, and his countenance immediately assumed an expression of corrugated amiability. "You come," he said, "apt to the moment. I had forgotten the number of your house. How do you do, Mr. Eden?" I was a little astonished at his familiar address, for I had never set eyes on the man before. I was a little annoyed, too, at his catching me with my boots under my arm. He noticed my lack of cordiality. "I wonder who the deuce I am, eh? A friend, let me assure you. I have seen you before, though you haven't seen me. Is there anywhere where I can talk to you?" I hesitated. The shabbiness of my room upstairs was not a matter for every stranger. "Perhaps," said I, "we might walk down the street. I'm unfortunately prevented—" My gesture explained the sentence before I had spoken it. "Oh, the very thing," he said, and faced this way and then that. "The street? Which way shall we go?" I slipped my boots down in the passage. "Look here," he said abruptly. "This business of mine is a rigmarole. Come and lunch with me, Mr. Eden. I'm an old man, a very old man, and not good at explanations, and what with my piping voice and the clatter of traffic—" He laid a persuasive, skinny hand that trembled a little on my arm. I was not so old that an old man might not treat me to lunch. Yet, at the same time, I was not altogether pleased by this abrupt invitation. I began. "But I had rather," he said, catching me up, "and a certain civility is surely due to my grey hairs." And so I consented and went with him. He took me to Blavitsky's. I had to walk slowly to accommodate myself to his paces, and over such a lunch as I had never tasted before. He fended off my leading question, and I took better note of his appearance. His clean-shaven face was lean and wrinkled, his shriveled lips fell over a set of false teeth, and his white hair was thin and rather long. He seemed small to me, though indeed most people seem small to me, and his shoulders were rounded and bent. And watching him, I could not help but observe that he, too, was taking note of me, running his eyes with a curious touch of greed in them over me from my broad shoulders to my sun-tanned hands and up to my freckled face again. "Then now," said he as we lit our cigarettes, "I must tell you of the business at hand. I must tell you, then, that I am an old man, a very old man." He paused momentarily. "And it happens that I have money that I must presently be leaving, and never a child have I to leave it to." I thought of the confidence trick, and I resolved that I would be on alert for the vestiges of my £500. He proceeded to enlarge on his loneliness and the trouble he had to find a proper disposition of his money. "I have weighed this plan and that plan, charities, institutions, and scholarships, and libraries, and I have come to this conclusion at last." He fixed his eyes on my face. "That I will find some young fellow, ambitious, pure-minded, and poor, healthy in body and healthy in mind, and, in short, make him my heir, give him all that I have." He repeated, "Give him all that I have, so that he will suddenly be lifted out of all the trouble and struggle in which his sympathies have been educated to freedom and influence." I tried to seem disinterested. With a transparent hypocrisy, I said, "And you want my help, my professional services, maybe, to find that person?" He smiled and looked at me over his cigarette, and I laughed at his quiet exposure of my modest pretense. "What a career such a man might have," he said. "It fills me with envy to think how I have accumulated that another man may spend. But there are conditions, of course, burdens to be imposed. He must, for instance, take my name. You cannot expect everything without some return, and I must go into all the circumstances of his life before I can accept him. He must be sound. I must know his heredity, and his parents, how they died, have the strictest inquiries made into his private morals." This modified my secret congratulations a little. "And do I understand that said I, that I—" "Yes," he said almost fiercely. You! I answered never a word. My imagination was dancing wildly. My innate skepticism was useless to modify its transports. There was not a particle of gratitude in my mind. I did not know what to say, nor how to say it. "But why me in particular?" I said at last. He had chanced to hear of me from Professor Hassler, he said, as a typically sound and sane young man, and he wished, as far as possible, to leave his money where health and integrity were insured. That was my first meeting with the little old man. He was mysterious about himself. He would not give his name yet, he said, and after I had answered some questions of his, he left me at the Blavitsky portal. I noticed that he drew a handful of gold coins from his pocket when it came to paying for the lunch. His insistence upon bodily health was curious. In accordance with an arrangement we had made, I applied that day for a life policy at the Loyal Insurance Company for a large sum, and I was exhaustively overhauled by the medical advisers of that company in the subsequent week. Even that did not satisfy him, and he insisted that I be re-examined by the great Dr. Henderson. It was Friday in Whitsun week before he came to a decision. He called me down quite late in the evening, nearly 9 it was, from cramming chemical equations for my preliminary scientific examination. He was standing in the passage under the feeble gas lamp, and his face was a grotesque interplay of shadows. He seemed more bowed than when I had first seen him, and his cheeks had sunk a little. His voice shook with emotion. "Everything is satisfactory, Mr. Eden," he said. "Everything is quite satisfactory. And this night of all nights, you must dine with me and celebrate your accession." He was interrupted by a cough. "You won't have long to wait either," he said, wiping his handkerchief across his lips and gripping my hand with his long bony claw that was disengaged. "Certainly not very long to wait." We went into the street and called a cab. I remember every incident of that drive vividly, the swift, easy motion, the vivid contrast of gas and oil and electric light, the crowds of people in the streets, the place in Regent Street to which we went, and the sumptuous dinner we were served with there. I was disconcerted at first by the well-dressed waiters' glances at my rough clothes, bothered by the stones of the olives. But as the champagne warmed my blood, my confidence revived. At first the old man talked of himself. He had already told me his name in the cab. He was Egbert Elvesham, the great philosopher, whose name I had known since I was a lad at school. It seemed incredible to me that this man, whose intelligence had so early dominated mine, this great abstraction, should suddenly realize itself as this decrepit, familiar figure. I dare say every young fellow who has suddenly fallen among celebrities has felt something of my disappointment. He told me now of the future that the feeble streams of his life would presently leave dry for me. Houses, copyrights, investments. I had never suspected that philosophers were so rich. He watched me drink and eat with a touch of envy. "What a capacity for living you have," he said, and then with a sigh of relief, I could have thought it. "It will not be long." "Aye," said I, my head swimming now with champagne. "I have a future, perhaps, of a passing agreeable sort, thanks to you. I shall now have the honor of your name, but you have a past, such a past as is worth all my future." He shook his head and smiled, as I thought, with half-sad appreciation of my flattering admiration. "That future," he said, "would you in truth change it?" The waiter came with liquors. "You will not perhaps mind taking my name, taking my position, but would you indeed willingly take my years?" "With your achievements," said I gallantly. He smiled again. "Kummer, both," he said to the waiter, and turned his attention to a little paper packet he had taken from his pocket. "This hour," said he, "this after-dinner hour is the hour of small things. Here is a scrap of my unpublished wisdom. He opened the packet with his shaking yellow fingers and showed a little pinkish powder on the paper. This, said he, well, you must guess what it is. But Kummel, put but a dash of powder in it is Himmel. His large greyish eyes watched mine with an inscrutable expression. It was a bit of shock to me to find this great teacher gave his mind to the flavour of liquors. However, I feigned an interest in his weakness, for I was drunk enough for such small sycophancy. He parted the powder between the little glasses, and rising suddenly with a strange, unexpected dignity, held out his hand toward me. I imitated his action, and the glasses rang. To a quick succession, said he, and raised his glass toward the lips. Not that, I said hastily, not that. He paused, with the liquor at the level of his chin, his eyes blazing into mine. To a long life, said I. He hesitated. To a long life, said he, with a sudden bark of laughter. And with his eyes fixed on one another, we tilted our little glasses. His eyes looked straight into mine, and as I drained the stuff off, I felt a curiously strange sensation. The first touch of it set my brain in a furious tumult. I seemed to feel an actual physical stirring in my skull, and a seething humming filled my ears. I did not notice the flavour in my mouth, the aroma that filled my throat. I saw only the grey intensity of his gaze that burnt into mine. The draught, the mental confusion, the noise and stirring in my head seemed at last to last an interminable time. Curious, vague impressions of half-forgotten things that danced and vanished on the edge of my consciousness. At last we broke the spell. With a sudden, explosive sigh, he put down his glass. Well, he said. Oh, it's glorious, said I, though I had not tasted the stuff. My head was spinning. I sat down. My brain was chaos. Then my perception grew clear and minute, as though I saw things in a concave mirror. His manner seemed to have changed into something nervous and hasty. He pulled out his watch and grimaced at it. 11:30, and tonight I must... 7:25, Waterloo. I must go at once. He called for the bill and struggled with his coat. Officious waiters came to our assistance. In another moment I was wishing him goodbye over the apron of a cab, and still with an absurd feeling of minute distinguish, as though... How can I express it? I not only saw, but felt through an inverted opera glass. That stuff, he said, he put his hand to his forehead. I ought not to have given it to you. It will make your head split tomorrow. Wait a minute. Here. He handed me a little flat thing like a seidlitz powder. Take that in water as you are going to bed. The other thing was a drug. Not till you're ready to go to bed, mind. It will clear your head, that's all. One more shake. Futorius. I gripped his shriveled claw. Goodbye, said he. And by the droop of his eyelids I judged that he, too, was a little under the influence of that brain-twisting cordial. He recollected something else with a start, felt in his breast pocket, and produced another packet, this time a cylinder the size and shape of a shaving stick. "Here," he said, "I'd almost forgotten. Don't open this until I come tomorrow. Oh, but take it now." It was so heavy that I well nigh dropped it. "All right," said I, and he grinned at me through the cab window as the cabman flicked his horse into wakefulness. It was a white packet he had given me with red seals at either end along its edge. "If this isn't money," said I, "it's platinum or lead." I stuck it with elaborate care into my pocket, and with a whirling brain walked home through the Regent Street loiterers and the dark back streets beyond Portland Road. I remember the sensations of that walk very vigorously, as they were. I was still so far myself that I could notice my strange mental state and wonder whether the stuff I had was opium, a drug beyond my experience. It is hard now to describe the peculiarity of my mental strangeness. Mental doubling vaguely expresses it. As I was walking up Regent Street, I found in my mind a queer persuasion that it was Waterloo Station, and had an odd impulse to get into the Polytechnic as a man might get into a train. I put a knuckle to my eye, and it was Regent Street again. How can I express it? You see a skillful actor looking quietly at you. He pulls a grimace, and lo, another person. Is it too extravagant if I tell you that it seemed to me as if Regent Street had, for the moment, done that? Then, being persuaded it was Regent Street again, I was oddly muddled about some fantastic reminiscences that cropped up 35 years ago, thought I. It was here that I quarrelled with my brother. Then I burst out laughing, to the astonishment and encouragement of a group of night prowlers. 30 years ago I did not exist, and never in my life had I boasted a brother. The stuff was surely liquid folly, for the poignant regret for that lost brother still clung to me. Along Portland Road, the madness took another turn. I began to recall vanished shops and to compare the street with what it had used to be. Confused, troubled thinking is comprehensible enough after the drink I had taken, but what puzzled me were these curiously vivid phantasm memories that had crept into my mind. And not only the memories that had crept in, but also the memories that had slipped out. I stopped opposite Stevens, the natural history dealers, and cudgeled my brains to think what he had to do with me. A bus went by and sounded exactly like the rumbling of a train. I seemed to be dipping into some dark, remote pit for the recollection. "Of course," said I at last, "he has promised me 3 frogs tomorrow." Odd that I should have forgotten. Do they still show children dissolving views? In those I remember one view would begin like a faint ghost and grow and oust another. In just that way it seemed to me that a ghostly set of new sensations was struggling with those of my ordinary self. I went on through Euston Road to Tottenham Court Road, puzzled, a little frightened, and scarcely noticed the unusual way I was taking, for commonly I used to cut through the intervening network of back streets. I turned into University Street to discover that I had forgotten my number. Only by a strong effort did I recall 11A, and even that, then it seemed to me that it was a thing some forgotten person had told me. I tried to steady my mind by recalling incidents of dinner, and for the life of me I could conjure up no picture of my host's face. I saw him only as a shadowy outline, as one might see oneself reflected in a window through which one was looking. In his place, however, I had a curious exterior vision of myself, sitting at a table flushed, bright-eyed, and talkative. "I must take this other powder," said I. "This is getting impossible." I tried the wrong side of the hall for my candle and my matches, and had a doubt of which landing my room might be on. "I am drunk," I said, "that's certain," and blundered needlessly on the staircase to sustain the proposition. At first glance, my room seemed unfamiliar. "What rot," I said, and stared about me. I seemed to bring myself back by effort, and the odd phantasmal quality passed into concrete familiar. There was the old glass still, with my notes on the albumens stuck in the corner of the frame, and my old everyday suit of clothes pitched about the floor. And yet it was not so real after all. I felt an idiotic persuasion trying to creep into my mind, as it were, that I was in a railway carriage in a train just stopping, that I was peering out of the window at some unknown station. I gripped my bed rail firmly to reassure myself. "It's clairvoyance, perhaps," said I. "I must write to the Psychical Research Society." I put the Rollo on my dressing table and sat on my bed, and began to take off my boots. It was as if a picture of my present sensations was painted over by some other picture that was trying to show through. "Curse it," said I, "my wits are going, or am I in two places at once?" Half undressed, I tossed the powder into the glass and drank it off. It effervesced and became a fluorescent amber color. Before I was in bed, my mind was already tranquilized. I felt the pillow at my cheek, and thereupon I must have fallen asleep. And here ends part 1. Of the story of the late Mr. Elvesham by H.G. Wells. Sorry, I had to scroll back up to the title. It had gone from my head. See you tomorrow for part 2 of The Story of the Late Mr. Elvesham by H.G. Wells. Have a good night. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.